My name is Benjamin Penny. I have the honour to head up the ANU Taiwan Studies program. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting tonight on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and would like to pay respect, both individually and on behalf of this institution, to elders past, present and emerging. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. I'd also like to extend respect and welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, and if, as may be so, there are Indigenous people from Taiwan here as well, I would like to acknowledge and welcome them in addition. It's especially wonderful to see everybody here, very gratifying to see such a healthy audience coming out for this Taiwan update. This is the second of the Taiwan updates that our Taiwan Studies program have run, but it's very special for us because it's the first one that we're holding in person. Last year was entirely online. In addition to this lecture tonight, we continue tomorrow afternoon with 3 talks by exceptional speakers and a screening of a fascinating recent Taiwanese documentary tomorrow evening. All those details are available from the front desk, and you're very welcome to attend. I'd now like to ask Professor Sally Wheeler, who's ANU's Deputy Vice-Chancellor, International and Corporate, to say a few welcoming words to us tonight.
Thanks very much, Ben. Can I also add my acknowledgement and celebration of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and recognise that this was, is and always will be Aboriginal land, and also to pay my respects to elders who might be here, past and present, and I extend that to any Indigenous people who are here. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome you this evening to this second ANU Taiwan update, and as Benjamin noted, this is the first one in person. I'd also like to thank very much Representative Xu of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Australia for joining us this evening, and for the very generous support of his office for today's events, as well as its support for Taiwan studies here at the university. Over the past 10 years or so, the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific has been gradually expanding the position of Taiwan studies in both its research and its curriculum offering. And thanks to the support of Taiwan's Ministry of Education, ANU is the only university in Australia and New Zealand that has an ongoing Taiwan studies program. We now have courses on histories of Taiwan, on Taiwan society, politics, and excitingly on Taiwanese language. Particularly important, I think, as we see languages gradually disappearing from the curriculums of our universities. Taiwan has a dynamic society, a very rich culture, and a complex history. So the study of Taiwan in and of itself is something that is rewarding for our students and staff across a range of fields. Taiwan also offers rich possibilities for engaging with Asia and the Pacific more generally. Its location geographically, historically, places it at the centre of developments that are key to an understanding of the region. And what comes to mind here is the Austronesian expansion, which traces the population of the Pacific to Taiwan's indigenous peoples. The interaction of East Asian cultures from the end of the Ming Dynasty to the present, as well as for issues of international relations and security in recent decades. So there is much that we can learn from Taiwan as we consider and engage with the Asia-Pacific region. Taiwan, we know, is never far from the news. So endeavouring to focus on expanding our understanding of Taiwan and its people is a really important thing to do. So I understand that tonight and tomorrow there are events that will look at Taiwan's upcoming presidential and legislative assembly elections and Taiwan's role in the world. I also understand that this is really heavily subscribed to, and that is so gratifying. I hope you all have a really intellectually engaging event, that you meet new people and you discuss the issues that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. And can I take this opportunity also to thank you for your wonderful service here at the ANU. Many people here perhaps don't know that Sally is moving on to pastures new at Birkbeck, University of London, towards the end of the year. And so we're very sorry to see you go, but thank you for what you've done and thank you for tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce our recently arrived, brand new representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, Mr. Douglas Hsu. We're very pleased that you were able to come to this update, that the timing worked for our new Taiwanese representative to be able to come. Prior to this appointment in Australia, Representative Hsu has largely worked in the North American sphere, and I think most recently was representative in Boston. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Representative Hsu here to say a few words.
Dr. Penny, Dr. Wheeler, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Douglas Hsu. I'm the representative of Taipei Economic Cultural Office in Australia. As well, Benjamin just mentioned that I just arrived, so smell very fresh. Yeah, but it's been a pleasure and my honors to join you on this a very special event, Taiwan Update, and hosted by CIW at the ANU. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Well, first and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the event organizer, ANU and CIW, for the commitment to fostering understanding and dialogue on Taiwan-related issues. I would also like to extend my thanks to Dr. Benjamin Penny for his invaluable support and dedication to this event. And also, I'd like to show my appreciation to the event sponsor, our Taiwanese Ministry of Education, to make it possible for people in Canberra to gain a deeper insight into Taiwan's cultural values and, well, most important, our society. And so I've been here for a month, and after I arrived, a lot of people asked me about Taiwan. And apparently, compared with, a decade ago, Taiwan's visibility has been raised in this part of the world. However, I also found that the depth of the understanding may be, still not there yet. So it was a very common question I was asked in the past month. How's the situation over there in Taiwan? Do you think it's, possible that, China's going to, declare war against Taiwan immediately? And that was also the reason that you have see the language here. Taiwan now has been characterized as the most dangerous place on earth. All of these discussions are, I would say, partially real. But for those who had the opportunities to visit Taiwan in the past year, you probably will return with the impression. Actually, most of the people in Taiwan are business as usual. You don't feel any tension. You don't feel the fearness among peoples. So I think the main issue was that most of the discussion about Taiwan was focused on the tension part of in the Taiwan Strait. However, we forget about the preparedness of Taiwan. Well, I think in the past few years, Taiwan has already proved that we are a quick learner. I would say 20 years ago, when Taiwan faced this SARS pandemic, we were, we reaching out to US CDC and try to learn experience from them how to contend this kind of a disease. And after that, we take real action to make sure that become a country's mechanism. So when we face this kind of a pandemic, we will know what to do. We have our standard SOP. And also, because of the big earthquake in Taiwan we encountered, and also we saw this nuclear power plant disaster because of the earthquake in Fukushima, that was the reason Taiwanese people has started to ask for the renewable energy instead of the nuclear power plant in Taiwan. And also, in the past few years, because of the economic coercion we face from PRC, we also learned that we have to restructure our supply chain. And so that was the reason I say Taiwan was a quick learner. We learned from what we've encountered. I think last year we encountered several events. Not encountered directly, but we learned from the Russians' invasion of Ukraine. We know that, if you like to some other countries to show their support to you in this kind of a scenario, you have to first show that you have the willingness to defend yourself. And of course, there are a lot of things to learn. How to beef up our asymmetric warfare capability, how to increase the resilience of the critical infrastructure on the island, how to beef up the food storage, energy storage, water storage during the wartime. And also, we learned that we have to polish our reserve force mobilization as well as their training so that we can have better civil defense capabilities while we're facing this kind of conflict. So there are a lot of things that we learned from last year's Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we, the Taiwanese government, as well as Taiwanese people, we took actions to address those issues. You may learn from the news report that Taiwan's defense budget has been increased for several years, and we're going to reach a new high next year for our national defense budget. And last year, even during the campaign year, President Tsai made a very difficult but courageous decision to extend our military conscription from 4 months to 1 year to show that, we are serious about, defending ourselves. So those are the things that we've been prepared for this possible contingency scenarios in that region. And of course, for the foreign service officer like myself, we are also doing something to strengthen this kind of a global network so that we can have some like-minded countries are willing to step up when it is needed to show their concern about peace and stabilities in the Taiwan Strait. And according to the track record in the past year or so, you saw like-minded countries like Japan, United States, Australia, and other European countries. They are willing to show their concern and oppose any unilateral change of the status quo in Taiwan Strait during those multilateral venues. So those are the kind of gestures that we are reaching out to those like-minded countries and help them to step up and show their concern about the peace and stability in Taiwan Strait. And more important, I think that you have to learn from what Taiwanese government has been doing. We've been practice those doctrines or military doctrines very cautiously, and so that we will not be labeled as a provocative side. So I think that we want to have this kind of preparedness and global networking continue. So that we can serve the purpose of deterrence to the threat at the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And I know that in the next days or so, we're going to have a discussion from those experts, and I look forward to learn from your insightful and enlightening discussion. And I hope that this is going to be a great event and successful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Representative Xu. It's good to hear about the preparations Taiwan is making, and let us all hope most profoundly that they're never needed. I don't think any of us want to see military action in your part of the world. That would be a terrible thing for all concerned. I'd like to now just thank once again Representative Xu and Professor Wheeler, who's had to go, and also thank and acknowledge the support that we've received over many years from the Taiwan Ministry of Education, and it's been wonderful support, and we wouldn't be doing these things if it wasn't for them. So, to tonight's lecture, I'd like to introduce our lecturer tonight, Brian Hioe. Brian is an old friend of our program. He's also a personal friend of mine over the years, and is, I think, an extraordinary person who does extraordinary work. Brian was educated at New York University and at Columbia in New York, and he returned to Taiwan and was involved, I think, one might say, profoundly and as a turning point in his life and career in the Sunflower Movement of 2014 that some of you are probably familiar with. Subsequent to that, he became a Democracy and Human Rights Service Fellow at the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, where he assembled a 400,000-word oral history of the Sunflower Movement. He also is now a non-resident fellow at the Taiwan Studies Program at the University of Nottingham in the UK, a program that we have close relationships with here at the ANU. Brian, after the Sunflower Movement, became the founding editor of what has become, I think, the most insightful website on Taiwanese affairs that there is. It's called New Bloom, and I recommend that you look at it. Anything that's happening in Taiwan of note, New Bloom is on top of. And that's not, it's no accident, because Brian is so incredibly well informed and diligent about keeping up with things. You might have seen Brian's name coming up more recently as he's getting better and better known, because he's being published in The Guardian, in The Washington Post, The Nation, The Diplomat, as well as many other print publications, online publications, and he's also appearing now in the media more and more as a talking head on Taiwan. He's also, apart from all of that, a translator of various academic and literary texts and video game scripts. And finally, New Bloom has expanded in a wonderful way and now has its own venue, like a real-life bricks and mortar venue in Taipei called Daybreak in the very old part of the city of Taipei in Wanhua. And it has become now it's becoming, I shouldn't exaggerate, becoming the kind of go-to place for political discussions, literary talks. It's a kind of focal point now for the intellectual life of, let's say, possibly progressive, possibly radical political action in Taipei. It's really quite a special place. It's also, apart from those earnest things, is also a venue in other respects where Brian sometimes DJs with his range of alternative musical tastes, some of which are really quite alternative. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome Brian here to speak on this topic. He is, as you've probably gathered from what I've said, I regard him as one of the most well-informed and original and insightful thinkers and writers on Taiwan today, which is why it's such a pleasure that he accepted our invitation to give the plenary address here at the Taiwan Update this year. Brian, the stage is yours.
Hi, everybody. So it's my pleasure to be back here after the long interim of COVID. And thanks again to Ben for the introduction, to Nancy and all the other organizers for putting this together. It's really great there's this Taiwan update to inform on political developments and cultural developments in Taiwan. And I'd like to join the others in acknowledging the traditional custodians of land as well. I think something quite heartening about the Taiwan update, for example, is the discussion of Taiwanese indigenous issues at a time in which there is still a struggle for recognition and much contemplation of identity. The title of my talk is From Austere Rock to Most Dangerous Place on Earth. And so this is a framing about how the political discussion of Taiwan has sometimes occurred in international discourse at a time of greater focus on Taiwan. The first slide then. Taiwan is an austere rock in a typhoon-laden sea with 24 million people. But this little island has, by universal acclaim, the most sophisticated microchip manufacturer in the world, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. About 100 miles away, across the straits, is mainland China, with 1.4 billion people. Most are the same ethnicity, speak the same language, and eat the same food as the people of Taiwan. But they have never been able to master the manufacture of those advanced logic chips that TSMC makes. And so this is from the New York Times op-ed section by Thomas Friedman. And this reference to Taiwan as an austere rock was reacted to very quickly. This dismissal of Taiwan's agency, that there are people, that it's not just this tiny austere rock, but it's beautiful, and there's nature, and there's skyscrapers, and vibrant night markets, and things like that. One also notes the kind of illusion here of Taiwan and China. Mainland China with 1.4 billion people. It's bigger, Taiwan is small. One continually sees this framing of Taiwan historically of Taiwan is small. Compared to China, it is very small. So China is so much larger. And then this kind of illusion of the differences, cultural, linguistic, and so forth, that most are the same ethnicity. For example, now referring to indigenous people, or the history of Han migration to Taiwan, that people speak the same language, not mentioning, for example, Taiwanese Hokkien or indigenous languages, and eat the same food. Well, I mean, there are distinctively Taiwanese food and beverages, anything from bubble tea to beef noodles and to sinki tofu and all those kind of things, but also more specific cultural developments that you don't see in China. But then this is reflective of how Taiwan is often discussed, because one has seen this focus on Taiwan as now the most dangerous place on Earth, a place for geopolitical conflict, in which there could potentially be world war breaking out between the great powers of the US and China. And once again, one does not see much about Taiwanese agency here, of the people, of what they want to see for the future. But it is quite an interesting shift that has occurred, because historically, Taiwan was discussed during the Cold War as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, in the words of Douglas MacArthur, a place, for example, during the Cold War where the US could have its forces, to have a way to really affect the region and to maintain a stronghold there. And one has seen this kind of framing return in some ways, but also in different ways. So for one, the geopolitical frame has returned, talking about Taiwan as the most dangerous place on Earth. But then there's all this focus on, for example, the other specificities of Taiwan to the world at present, that Taiwan produces semiconductors. Taiwan produces 65% of 90% of advanced chips and 65% of global capacity. Semiconductors are used in everything from your iPhone to your PlayStation to your electronic vehicle and so forth. And so what is thought, this argument is sometimes referred to as the silicon shield, is that the US and Western powers are dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors that are needed for electronics. It's particularly COVID-19 with supply chain shortages very clearly illustrated this. Even if there had been some discussion of the way in which the Western countries were becoming dependent on Taiwan for some decades, and much is centralized on TSMC, which is an industry giant and often has framed its successes as due to the uniqueness of Taiwan, that it is an island in which you have very talented engineers. You can have engineers traveling around to different parts of the island in case there's a breakdown somewhere in the supply chain and fixing things around the clock. But then it is also thought that China is dissuaded from attacking Taiwan because it is also reliant on Taiwanese semiconductors, because of the fact that their electronics manufacturing also use Taiwanese semiconductors. And so we do have this kind of rise of a hyperbolic discourse on Taiwan, as though invasion could occur tomorrow, as though it were imminent, when I think there's actually quite a lot of detail that is left out of there. And so one frame for this is that the US and China are contending over Taiwan because of semiconductors, that both require these, that this is almost like the new oil, and that's why there's this geopolitical tension. And so I think what is so interesting is that there's been a lot of shift in discussions of Taiwan across the past decade. Ben brought up his introduction that I was part of the Sunflower Movement. And during that point in time, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, there's not as much focus on Taiwan, but particularly there has been much more in the past year, effectively just 1 year. Last August, US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and it was a historic visit, as the first visit by a Speaker of the House in a quarter century. China responded then by launching military exercises on a scale not seen since the Third Taiwan Straits crisis. This took place close to Taiwan than during the crisis, and since then one has seen an escalation in Chinese military activity around Taiwan. For example, by the time of the August exercises, it had already been the case that China would launch fighter jets into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. This is the airspace around Taiwan in which airplanes normally identify themselves for security purposes. But this has increased as time has gone on into Xi Jinping's presidency to a near daily basis. And this reached new heights during the exercises that followed Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. There was much more naval activity that took place during this time. That was something new. And one has seen this continue since then. For example, when Pelosi's successor as US Speaker of the House met with Tsai in California during a stopover by Tsai through California, this was also responded to by the Chinese military with exercises. And most recently then with the Vice President, William Lai Ching-te, who is the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, the currently ruling party in Taiwan, which is historically center-left and currently adheres to a pro-status quo position, but is historically pro-independence. China also responded with exercises, and so that was last August. And so now one has seen much international hand-wringing about the possibility for conflict. For example, again, Friedman, just why Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is utterly reckless. This view then that, for example, the increase of support by Western countries for Taiwan or these shows of support are dangerous and that this will actually heighten regional tensions. And again, as I pointed out, there's much more military activity. This is occurring, but it does not occur close enough to Taiwan that people are freaking out, panicking in the streets, and so forth. And so as someone that through the years is doing much more talking head appearances on media, it is actually quite an interesting experience. The perception gap that exists within Taiwan and outside of it. Sometimes there will be something like this, which occurs sometimes daily, and international media will suddenly be calling up as though this is a new major development, as though China has escalated to a kind of new height along the lines of the post-Pelosi exercises or Tsai's meeting with McCarthy, when this is not always the case. And so it is quite interesting noting when international media hones in on something that is quite mundane in Taiwan and has been for a while. And that kind of gets at the kind of bulk of what I would talk about, or the theme that I'm trying to highlight here, which is that at a time in which Taiwan has received much more international focus, there are some elements that have been left out of this. For one, there is the view of Taiwanese on their own future, their own perspectives. But also, while there is much hyperbolic discussion of the potential for invasion, people in Taiwan are not panicking, and who is most directly in the line of fire? It is, in fact, Taiwanese themselves. And so then one does have this discussion in the New York Times or other mainstream outlets or television networks as though this war was imminent. And I think that is something that bears pushing back on. The view that war is inevitable could perhaps make it more likely to occur. And I think that for decades, effectively, Taiwanese have sought to behave politically in a pragmatic manner aimed at maintaining the existence of democratic institutions that are hard won through a struggle against authoritarianism in past decades and from the threat contemporary of Chinese invasion, but without provoking China in a way. And so I think that is something that we can discuss and kind of focus on, because I do think this is a place in which Taiwan perhaps does have lessons for the world, how to pragmatically avoid an invasion while also maintaining democratic freedoms and prevent a conflict that can embroil the region. And so a bit more about, for example, the decades of political developments and kind of the movement that I came out of, the Sunflower Movement in 2014. This involved the occupation of the Taiwanese legislature for a month, and these are pictures that I took during the movement. That was in protest of a trade agreement that the then ruling party, the KMT, the Kuomintang, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, hoped to pass, and that would have allowed for Chinese investment in Taiwan's service sector industry. The fear from student activists, among which was myself, was that this would allow for China to influence institutions in Taiwan. For example, in past years, the media had already been affected. There were cases of Taiwanese businessmen that are much more pro-China buying up Taiwanese media outlets and trying to push them in a much more pro-China direction to improve views of China in Taiwan. And that often meant not reporting on the bad things that were occurring in China, the human rights abuses, for example, with Xinjiang, or downplaying this, the arrest of human rights lawyers. These various stories, they were being kept out of the media, and that was a matter of concern. And for example, then with this trade agreement, the cross-strait services trade agreement, if it allowed for Chinese investment in Taiwan's service sector industry, perhaps you would see the same in terms of self-censorship. Then that would have much more impact on Taiwan's economy because of the size of the service sector industry. And so that was a movement that I was part of. And this was a generational moment. There were, at its peak on March 30th, 2014, 500,000 people in the streets of Taipei, which is something like 2.5% of the population. Young people, many of which entered politics after, running for office or joining the government or becoming part of civil society in various capacities. This really kind of changed the social views of young people. Previously, there was the bemoaning of young people as a kind of soft and weak strawberry generation, and the verdict shifted to seeing young people as willing to take risks for their future. And what is so interesting, though, about this and the kind of international context is there was scarcely any reporting of it on the time. It was much more overshadowed by the Malaysian flight that disappeared the same month. And so there were various attempts by youth activists, for example, such as myself, to really get this into the international sphere because of this delicate relationship with China. The movement, as I think many of the participants believed, showed that a generation of Taiwanese don't identify with China, that they view themselves as independent, and they were concerned about closer political ties with China. Identity polls also show that Taiwanese identity is continuously on the rise, Chinese identity is on the decline, and even dual identity is on the decline because there are these various identity contestations in Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, after the Kuomintang came to Taiwan and framed Taiwan as quintessentially having been part of China and instituted an educational system intended to teach this. Young people don't always take this view because unlike their parents or grandparents, even if they're descended from those that came with the KMT to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s, they don't have the direct experience of China, nor do they have nostalgia for China. And they've seen the political and economic rise of China, as well as that what it means in terms of, for example, the deterioration of democratic freedoms. And so what then of Taiwan's relation to the world if the world doesn't realize that this is what Taiwanese young people have are thinking and feeling about their relationship with China? And so that was the impetus behind founding New Bloom and so forth. And I think that's why it's so interesting to think about this shift in Taiwan, in which there was not a lot of coverage a decade ago. Now there's quite a lot of coverage. Because another factor of this is, Hong Kong. And this is a picture I took in 2019 when I was in Hong Kong to report on the protests that had broken out there against an extradition agreement that would have allowed for Hong Kongers to be extradited to China to face charges. It was feared that this would have led to political persecution of dissidents, and so it inspired massive protests, among the largest by the population in modern history, a population of around 7 million and 2 million protesting in the streets at one point. And so what was interesting is that the umbrella movement, which occurred in 2014, a predecessor to the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, that received much more coverage at the time, even if it just broke out around 6 months after the Sunflower Movement, and even if there were ties between Taiwanese and Hong Kong activists, that the movements tried to learn from each other and, in fact, did share tactics, for example, trying to occupy space or invade the legislature. And so what I find so interesting is that this has shifted because as things have gotten worse in Hong Kong, there have been much more journalists, for example, relocating to Taiwan. It is no longer possible for international media to report on China from within China as easily. And though Hong Kong historically was a place that journalists could report on what occurs in China with relative freedom, it was, of course, because of the history of British colonialism, not controlled by the CCP until recently, and the deterioration of political freedoms in Hong Kong in past decades did occur gradually, but then now that is not possible. And so one does have much more media reporting on Taiwan. It is kind of a dark irony because at the time of the 2019 protests, there was some discussion of how this was the perfect storm for international coverage of the events there because China had driven out so many journalists from within China itself to Hong Kong, and so they would report on what was occurring around them. And now it is the case that one has people moving to Taiwan, though you also do have the case of people moving elsewhere, to Tokyo, to Seoul, and etc. And so this has been a very large shift, and I think this is kind of worth noting, because previously, what was often critiqued about the coverage of Taiwan in past decades was that it was often written from Beijing, that there would be journalists writing on what occurred in Taiwan from Beijing. And so in that sense, not actually reflecting the kind of Taiwanese perspectives that exist. And so now we do have people in Taiwan, and so there has been some improvement. It's ironic, too, because of the fact that this was a situation of China's own making. And I think particularly China would hope for there to be less coverage of Taiwan, for less opportunities for Taiwanese perspectives to be heard. And yet it is the domestic repression in China and also Hong Kong that's led to the situation. But even as there are now journalists, international correspondents, locally reporting on Taiwan with greater nuance, sometimes covering stories that were written about in the past, but now with kind of greater detail and more attention to what are local perspectives, there is still this kind of discourse internationally that prevails about Taiwan. And so often it is in the pages of op-ed sections, like the ones I highlighted, and often does discuss Taiwanese as though they are geopolitical pawns without agency of their own, as though Taiwan is still just a chess piece between the US and China. And so what is interesting then is that there is greater discussion then now in Taiwan of the threat from China. People are not panicking in the streets, as I said, but it is interesting to think about what has led to this. And so, for example, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that's been a major factor in the major kind of the shift in discussing the need for readiness in Taiwan. Because what one sees now, particularly among the younger generation, is attempts to prepare, calls for improving military training. Because though there is military training in the form of a draft, there have been long critiques of this, increasing the military budget. But more significantly, there have been civilian-led civil defense trainings to try and ensure that people know what to do in the event of an attack on Taiwan. And this includes anything from the images you see sometimes reported on international media of people learning how to use guns and practicing with paintball guns, for example, or airsoft guns, but also just basic things like medical treatment. What do you do if someone is bleeding out next to you? What do you do to put on a tourniquet or dress the wound and so forth? What kind of structures can you hide behind if there's gunfire around you? Because buildings in Taiwan are made of different materials. What materials blocks gunfire? And also things such as what are the propaganda narratives that China circulates to try to sap the desire of Taiwanese people to resist an invasion. Because if there is no desire to fight back, then that makes it more possible for China to take Taiwan. And so one does see this kind of increase in self-organized efforts at defense. And what is so interesting is that even as China conducts these military exercises around Taiwan in the airspace and maritime domains around Taiwan, this occurs at a distance. It does not occur in such a way that you can see just a fighter jet flying overhead. It does not occur in Taiwanese cities, of course. And so this actually occurs quite far removed from the everyday lives of most Taiwanese people. That is one reason, I think, that people are not panicking in the streets. And likewise, the fact that there have been threats for decades, I think it does cause Taiwanese to become somewhat inured to these threats. People are quite used to it. There's not the strong reaction, actually, that one saw in decades past during the 1990s when there was another Straits crisis of people moving abroad. That did not occur this time. And I think part of it is actually quite interesting. It's on China, that China has not built up a narrative of developing, escalating, and progressive threats. People don't always pay attention to whether it's 1 plane today, 5 planes tomorrow, and 20 planes the day after. It's all just planes to them. And so that, I think, is a failure on the Chinese part to communicate a sense of growing threat. But then, on the other hand, the war in Ukraine created all these images that are circulating now of war, of what Taiwan could potentially look like if war broke out, of these very human stories of Ukrainians that are civilians as Russia attacks civilian centers, but also inspiring stories of resistance. And there have also been cases of Taiwanese traveling to Ukraine to participate as volunteers in fighting. And so, interestingly enough, as there are these military exercises, Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, arguably created more of a direct sense of threat as it is perceived by many people, because there are no sharp visuals of these fighter jets or Navy vessels and so forth, and whereas in Ukraine there's plenty of that. And so that provoked a stronger sense of alarm. And then you do also have Hong Kong. I mean, this is a picture of a solidarity rally in Taipei for Hong Kong, calling for against Article 23 of the Basic Law, against this attempt to crack down on political freedoms. And the man you see in front, the bald man with glasses, is Li Mingjie, who is a Taiwanese NGO worker who was kidnapped by China for 5 years. After crossing into China, he is thought to have been detained for discussing with Chinese friends the experiences of Taiwan's democratization, and this led to his arrest and imprisonment. Now he is out and active and being quite vocal about the need to be cautious of what China claims and the promises that it tries to lure Taiwan in under. But I have this image here as a kind of illustrative example of how then Hong Kong shows to demonstrate the what would happen to Taiwan if it were to become part of China. And so that does lead to this increase in a sense of threat. And Hong Kong, similar to Ukraine, produced so many images of fighting in the streets, such as the pictures that I myself took, of these young students, for example, clashing with police, or even being found dead under mysterious circumstances, of being reporting of torture, even sexual assault within jails, for example. And so you do have a sense of solidarity with both Taiwan, from Taiwan with Ukraine and Hong Kong. Those were causes in which Taiwan, there were daily solidarity rallies that took place. And it's quite a kind of interesting phenomenon because though these are distant causes, Taiwanese did see themselves as having a kind of stake in these struggles, that Taiwan itself would also have to lose with the deterioration of democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, in which Taiwan has long felt a sense of affinity with the pro-democracy actors there, whether one goes back to the 2014 umbrella movement or earlier. And then Ukraine, although I don't think there was a lot of focus on Ukraine and Taiwan before that, the invasion really did lead to the sense of a shared struggle, because there are quite a lot of parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan in terms of the fact that you do have a large neighbor that claims you have no distinctive language or culture or history of your own, that you are a state that was just created out of them and can return back to the motherland. And so that's also another factor. And I think what is also interesting, going back to the theme of this talk, is that this does lead to further discussion of Taiwan. There's almost a kind of sense that a rising tide causes all boats to float higher, or whatever that synonym, that metaphor is. Because the greater focus on Ukraine or Hong Kong also does lead to increasing discussion of Taiwan. And I think the interesting thing to point to then is shifts in the international narrative on Taiwan. For example, at Tsai, the president did apologize to indigenous groups on behalf of the state. Although she herself is part indigenous, in fact, she apologized on behalf of the state. There are still contentions regarding traditional territories, which were the ones that are in private hands were not returned to indigenous groups. The ones in public hands, in the hands of the government, were. And so this story then comes up in international discourse as a way to highlight how Taiwan has now quite progressive in many ways under the current administration, and that there is this acknowledgement of Taiwan's cultural diversity, even if on that there are still many points to be worked on. Or that Taiwan legalized gay marriage as the first country in Asia to do so. That is also another thing that distinguishes Taiwan from China at a time in which China is cracking down on representations of quote-unquote feminine men, or in which there's been targeting of LGBTQIA activists and feminist activists. And so this comes up now as part of the discourse. And I think this is not something that I would have seen a decade ago, around the time of the Sunflower Movement. There would not have been this focus on Taiwan in a way that differentiates itself from China, because historically what occurred is that although during the Cold War there was much media stationed in Taiwan because they could not get to China, eventually once China opened up with the economic development, they did largely relocate to China. And that led to a kind of overshadowing of Taiwan's perspective during those years. And so I think there are a lot of points to be worked on. And though the kind of geopolitical focus on Taiwan does in fact allow for more space to discuss, and I even think that these stories about indigenous representation or the legalization of gay marriage often come up actually as a kind of indirect result of the geopolitical frame on Taiwan and China and the US as a way to differentiate Taiwan from China. I think that there's still improvement, but there's still things to work on. And for example, again, this is my own attempt in The Guardian to raise that Taiwan is caught between China and the US, and there's still much international discourse that acts as though it is not important to think about what Taiwanese think and feel. And I mean, here's another attempt by Clarissa Wei to basically argue then that, reemphasizing the point that while much of the world was kind of melting down about the possibility of World War III, because of the conflict between the US and China over the Pelosi visit, it's not as though this could occur at the drop of the hat, that the lives of people in Taiwanese society go on regularly, and there has not been such a kind of panic in the streets yet, though there are kind of measured steps to try and prepare for the possibility of a Taiwan contingency. And so another quite interesting thing is that there's always been this kind of boilerplate text on Taiwan, and there is a need for this in news. I am someone that also works in news, to kind of sum up world politics for those that may not know as much about a specific area. And historically, this was always the boilerplate text for Taiwan. This is from Reuters. China regards Taiwan as a renegade province to be brought back under its sovereignty by force if necessary. One sees this kind of renegade province framing, but one now has seen shifts, calls directly to stop using this terminology because it does privilege China's perspective, emphasizing then China's view of Taiwan as part of it through time immemorial, the attempt by which then China claims Taiwan, its people, to have no independent determination of their own, no will for self-determination. And I think that international media can sometimes be complicit in that, and now we see the calls for growing nuance, growing complexity, and that's definitely a welcome development. Here's another one along those similar lines. And so there's much more talk of this now. But then I think what is interesting too is, here's another one. Just for example, there's always the framing of groups that are more historically pro-independence of being troublemakers, just causing trouble through trying to assert Taiwan's sovereignty from China. And this framing still does occur. I mean, what I mean to show with this slide is that it's from the BBC. It's not perfect yet. There are still a lot of room for improvement, but there have been a shift in the media narrative, even if I think there's much to be worked on. But then I think in terms of this discussion of military preparedness and so forth, there's a lot of focus on the military side of things, but also what are average Taiwanese thinking and feeling at the moment. And what I find interesting is that there are books now that discuss, for example, defense readiness for a general audience. This is by Admiral Li Xingming, who is the former chief of staff of the military. And this is calling for asymmetric defense for Taiwan. He's making an argument, but he went directly to the public to make this kind of claim because he is trying to influence policy. And this is another book by Puma Shen and Wang Li. Puma Shen is best known for his research on disinformation, but this is a book outlining scenarios of what happens if China attacks, and it's kind of framed as a sort of mythbusters of the kind of folk tales about if China attacks, that, for example, an invasion could occur at the drop of a hat, that it would not, the resistance is futile, or that you would have the airports in Taipei being stormed and taken over by paratroopers, and so forth. Because, as I mentioned, China is all the more likely to invade if there is not resistance, because of the fact that the death toll from a Chinese invasion would still be substantial. Recent war game by CSIS, the think tank, claimed 80,000 losses, though one has seen higher than that in other assessments. It would at least be in the tens of thousands, and it would be a very complicated exercise to pull off, involving both air, land, sea. Just the kind of amphibious assault would be very difficult to coordinate. And it could not occur at the drop of a hat, actually. I mean, I think that's the thing that really bothers me about this international focus on Taiwan, when suddenly I see a lot of text messages saying, do you want to be on this program to discuss the threats from China? Because there would be preparation in advance. We would be able to see this by satellite. And I think talking about war as it would occur imminently at the drop of a hat is not actually helpful, and does actually contribute to tensions. And I think this is worth focusing on, because as Taiwanese go about their daily lives, then that is the actuality of what is occurring in Taiwan, rather than this kind of international media narrative about imminent warfare. And so then, I mean, one sees, for example, major newspapers like the Liberty Times now having defense sections to discuss just what would happen, or the techniques of the military for a general audience. And these are kind of newer developments that I see taking place in Taiwan. Here's another. This is from The Reporter, which is an investigative media outlet. And I always find this quite interesting, because now one has even kind of very progressive outlets that usually in the past years have focused on kind of progressive social issues, now also discussing kind of military affairs. And so you have a lot of kind of discussion then of the scenarios and timelines for an invasion. 2027 is thrown around oftentimes as a potential date. To clarify, that is the date that China could potentially invade Taiwan. They have the capacity to. It doesn't mean they will, because again, you would be losing a lot of lives. Could the CCP endure that at present? Could they swallow that loss of life and weather the blow to their political legitimacy that would take place? Also, the economic effect. We talked about semiconductors at the start of this. The fact that China is also dependent on Taiwan for semiconductors. Thus, if you do attack Taiwan, what happens to the economy? The economies of China and Taiwan are deeply interlinked to begin with. The Taiwanese economy is large enough that there would be a global crisis if just that went into crisis in some form, much less that the Chinese economy was slowing before COVID-19. And so though you have this kind of timeline being floated around, and I think the attempt from the US military brass or other officials is to really pressure Taiwan to make more changes, to increase the military budget to often the amount is 5% that is talked about, or to re-extend the draft, which did eventually take place. But then there are other obstacles preventing China from invading. And I think that dialing back this hyperbolic rhetoric sometimes can also be helpful. And I think that that is where actually Taiwanese are at present in terms of what they are thinking and feeling about their lives. And I think that's the key point to note. Because we are going to an election year, and I think this is maybe something we could talk a bit about in the discussion in Q&A. And so once again, Taiwanese will go to the polls to have a referendum on what choice they feel is safest for Taiwan. I mean referendum not in the terms of an independence referendum, as is sometimes floated as a possible idea, and the often discussion is that China would retaliate with military force if that ever take place. But even just voting for the president as part of regular democratic institution in Taiwan, that is also a referendum on the choice that Taiwanese feel is the safest for maintaining their political freedoms and avoiding an invasion, and a pragmatic way of doing so. But then China will still inevitably frame that as a provocation. And so I think it is quite important then to think about what the views of Taiwanese leading up to the election are in terms of their belief about who they are and what their future should be, and what is a way to avoid a conflict that drags everyone to the region. Because the framing of Taiwan as troublemaker is problematic, as though Taiwan is willing to let the world burn for independence. But in reality, everything is interlinked. And so there is no way for Taiwan to maintain its democratic freedoms if there is conflict, or if it drags other people into conflict and somehow Taiwan stays removed from that. And so I think events like this are very welcome as a way to kind of have these conversations. And so I'd again like to close on the note of thanking the organizers for putting this together. And so last, I'll just put up social media in case anyone wants to get in touch. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks again.